and who's here today that we're going to have, are we intending to have three of the five, or excuse me, four of the five current members here today? No,
We'll have all five.
we do have all
All five
five.
will be here.
All five, okay, great.
Yeah.
So they've
Three-
been sworn in and they're actually members of the board now.
Yeah,
Perfect.
there's right. Even if they haven't been sworn in yet, there's they've been appointed and that still makes them a valid member, but they're working on getting sworn in.
Isn't it a
But-
court order by the judge? Do they even have to be? I don't recall being sworn in. I just remember a court order approving it.
It's up to the judge. I think the code says you have to be sworn in, but it's certainly that person's purview.
Okay.
But yeah, we do have two new members since the last time we met. And I've been providing them with all sorts of training materials to try to get them up to speed. For instance, what is the BZA? What's the purpose of the BZA?
Yeah.
And so Mr. Becker's here and Mr. Ahmed is here as well. And then I've
Okay.
also invited the two alternates to join us so that they have the opportunity to kind of shadow and watch a meeting. And so
Okay.
in all, there's 4 new members. So it's pretty cool.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yep.
That's pretty awesome. And I think that it'd be good to get to know all the new members on the board. It would probably be good to be cognizant of the time of the applicant.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, as soon as it looks like we do have 5 people now. So, it's whenever you want to start. The applicant's here. There's no one else representing him today. And so if you're ready to roll, we can do that.
I'm ready. Is everyone else ready?
I'm ready. That's what we're here for.
Okay. So I'm just gonna read the staff report. It was pretty lengthy, about 4 pages, and so I'm not gonna read every word, but I'm gonna hit some highlights. At which point then you're welcome to ask me questions, and then it is up to the applicant to present his case, and I believe he's gonna share his screen. So, and then you can ask him questions, and then we'll have a public hearing, but I doubt anyone from the public is gonna come. So, and then, it's up to the board to talk and decide whether or not the applicant should be granted an appeal, or if you're gonna rule in favor of the city. And then afterwards, I did a little agenda, but it's brief. Afterwards, I think we need to pick or vote on who should the chair and the vice chair be going forward to lead the meetings, and then adjournment. And so it'll be pretty brief tonight, depending how long this case lasts. So this is BZA 21-9-001. The property in question is at 900 River Road. The applicant is Mr. Bo Carrington. The zoning of the property is industrial corridor. This is going to be a proposed mixed use development. And the applicant is actually appealing a determination having to do with setbacks. It was stated that 100% of the building facade must be located within 0 feet minimum and 20 feet maximum, as stated in section 34-457, subsection B, subsection 5, subsection I of the zoning ordinance. So unfortunately, this has kind of taken a long time to get to us due to scheduling conflicts, but the applicant did reach out to me in June, asking to confirm the way he interpreted the code. It was stated that he felt in districts without a minimum percentage, the maximum setback requirement is satisfied by the front yard being no greater than the maximum setback. The definition seems to tie together clearly from build to zone to maximum setback to front yard. Just trying to gather how he should interpret the setbacks. And I told him that it's always been my interpretation that 100% of the structure frontage must be within the min-max setback unless it's specifically otherwise noted. The emails are in there as exhibit 1 and 2. So as a note, council establishes maximum setbacks. Clearly, if a minimum setback is a requirement and it applies to the entire facade of a building, i.e. no portion of the facade can be closer to the property line than the minimum required setback distance, necessarily follows that a maximum setback prohibits any portion of a facade of a building from being further away from a property line than the maximum required setback distance. So I highlighted what I thought were 4 relevant definitions in our zoning code. That's the last section in our code, section 1200. There's yard, which refers to the distance between the exterior facade of a building and any projection thereof other than steps, unenclosed balconies, uncovered, unenclosed porches, and adjacent property line. So the note with my staff note is clearly the definition of yard refers to the entire facade of a building and does not contemplate any one portion of a facade being at a different distance from a property line than another portion. There's yard front, which is the yard extending across the front of a lot between the sidelines, and the minimum horizontal distance between the street right-of-way line and the main building and any projection thereof other than steps. There's setback, which it says C yard, and then there's build to zone, which is the area between the minimum and maximum allowable setbacks along a street. It should also be noted that in the IC zoning district, it doesn't refer to build to zone. So that term doesn't even come up in this zoning district. It does, however, come up in a couple, like 5 other zoning districts where it talks about percentages, such as the downtown, I think it says 75% of the street wall has to be within a certain range. And that's where that would apply. So there's 20 different mixed use commercial and industrial zoning districts in the city, and 5 have different percentages. Those are the Cherry Avenue, downtown, West Main East, West Main West, and Corner District. So the definition of build to zone would be relevant in those 5 zoning districts. And the definition states that the building facade may be required to maintain a minimum or minimum percentage of the building in those zoning districts. So that's the exception to the rule. The rule otherwise is 100% of your facade has to be within the min-max range. And otherwise, in those 5 districts, that's where that exception would come into play. So in the 15 districts where there isn't a min-max percentage, you would use the definition yard / front. A yard extending across the front of a lot between the side yard lines and being the minimum horizontal distance between the street right-of-way line and the main building of any projection thereof other than steps. These districts, which include IC, clearly state the minimum and maximum setbacks required in each zoning district. 100% of the facade of the structure must be located within this area of a parcel, consistent with the definition of required yard and the provisions of the IC corridor regulations applicable to River Road in the section that we stated, 34-440, subsection 5, subsection B, subsection I. And this is the interpretation that's been applied by city staff and the zoning administrator since the adoption of the zoning ordinance on September 15th, 2003. I just wanted to note that, you know, I think the applicant is trying to apply the section to help justify why he should be able to build his project in the manner he wants, and that's fine. But on a larger scale, this appeal and the BZA's decision will impact every development in the city, in districts and locations where minimums and maximum setbacks are specified without city council having expressly authorized different portions of a building facade to be at different distances from an adjacent property line. The city attorney added a couple of things in here that she thought was pertinent that you should know about when you make your ruling, and hopefully you've read through it. I'm not going to go through those, but those are the limitations that the BZA has to follow when they make their decision, and we can talk about those more if you have specific questions. But otherwise, that concludes my staff report, and I'd be happy to ask any questions or answer any questions if you have those. It's a lot of information, and it's hard to communicate on a medium like this, but you know, fire away if you do.
So I got a question just about,
Yes, sir.
I got a question just about general protocol. Seems to me that this is best adjudicated by the Planning Commission and City Council. Why didn't the applicant ask for a waiver through that process?
Well, we're still at I think we're in the infancy of the process where we're just, you know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Carrington, is under a contract to purchase the property and is still in the design phase, and he doesn't know how he should you know, design this structure. He'll go into that a little more, but he hasn't even gotten into, you know, how many dwelling units he wants to have. He is required to, and he's put up his screen here, but
This is me, but yeah.
Yep, he is required, you know, eventually go through the site plan process, and with mixed use in that zoning district, it appears he can have up to 21 dwelling units if it's a mixed use. I'm sorry, up to 21 dwelling units per acre if it's a mixed use project. And then he can have between 22 and 64 dwelling units if he gets a special use permit. Now,
the other,
go ahead. I was just,
go ahead, please.
yeah, I just was talking to about an hour ago to one of our new members, Sakib, and he had asked the question about, is there any other method for him to be able to get that waiver or change the setbacks? And I wasn't sure, so I just spoke to Missy Creasy, and she said that through the special use permit process, there is the ability to waive setbacks and change those up. You know, normally, as you're aware, people always want to reduce those, but this is the first case that I've had where someone wants to increase what their setback requirement would be. So that would be something that could come up if Mr. Carrington applied for a special use permit seeking more density. I don't know if that's what he wants to do, because we're still kind of in the very early stages, despite the fact that he's been working on it for 3 months.
Yeah, I mean, I'll listen and see what else other people have to say and what Bo has to say, but it seems to me that the Planning Commission and the Council would be, and the SUP would be the most expedient and most proper way to adjudicate this. The other question I've got is relating to the setback. Is the issue that this design encroaches upon the setback, or what is the issue exactly?
The issue is that the way the L-shaped building, as you see on the screen, that the facade of the longer portion is not within the min-max setback. So the front square is within that setback, being the setback, but the longer rectangle is not. So that piece staff feels needs to be closer to the street. And through this appeal, the applicant would like to have the board rule that he would be able to construct something like that.
Okay, so it's not that this encroaches it within the 20 feet here.
So normally in the industrial corridor, there's zero setback, like no requirement. You could have it all the way in the back, but because he's proposing mixed use or residential, he then would have to meet the whole portion of the building has to be within 0 feet as a minimum or 20 feet maximum from the property line. That is what he's trying to accomplish. And that's where, unfortunately, that's where we are, still at a stalemate, and it's delayed his
Reed,
going
can I
any
just,
further. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
sorry, I know I'm not supposed to speak yet, so I'll wait if you want, but I was just gonna try and point out that the reason that there's a maximum setback here is actually not that it's mixed use, it's actually that it's on the primary corridor of River Road.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I can pull open my code and read exactly what it says.
So while you're doing that, in your opinion, the offending piece is the long rectangle and the fact that it's so far back. Is that right?
Yeah, that would,
Yeah.
the whole, I mean, we're calling every part of that front of that building the facade. So we have the smaller piece being the square. Front of that facade is in that min-max setback, but the longer piece down there is not, and that's the issue that staff has, that we don't feel it meets the setbacks stated in the zoning code.
So are you saying this has to be either at 0 or within
Yes.
20?
Anywhere in between. He could have it at 12, he could have it at 19, but if he's if he has it at 22, that's too big.
Yeah. Well, because the code says it is, what's the underlying logic?
The underlying logic is that the code, because the code doesn't specify that there's a reduction, like, so in those 5 other zoning districts, it says 75% can be within this range, and then the other, must be a certain setback, and then the remaining 20% can be in the, however far. But so there's variables there. Those are the exceptions. Otherwise, the rule is the 100%. Now, I don't know what the logic is because I didn't write this ordinance. I'm the only one, I'm the person who enforces the ordinance. I wasn't there when they wrote this. I wasn't out of college yet when this was adopted. So
do you have any thoughts as to why? Because it just seems to me that your property further away from the road would be more desirable to the community at large, just at the outset.
I think in most of so when you're designing a city and you're looking at some of the other districts, having a building closer to the street, like for instance, on the 29 corridor, because the speed limit is so fast, then the min-max tends to be a little bigger to push the buildings further away from the street. But in the downtown area, you want the businesses right up to the property line because they're very walkable. It's an urban planning
Gotcha.
method, and that's that's what the planning, the city council decided to do, is they made these min-max, and so it gives developers an opportunity to decide, well, do we want this 0 feet from the street, or do we want it 20 feet from the street? But it has to be somewhere in that range.
Gotcha. So
but
it's
then
also,
yeah, go ahead. I was just saying, in like the Cherry Avenue corridor, it says up to 75% has to be within the min-max. So that gives the developer the ability to say, okay, well, I'm going to design a structure that has 75% within this range, and then the other 25%, I'll decide.
gotcha. So it sounds like to me two underlying logic two items of underlying logic here. One being perhaps walkability for people walking to the site. And then I guess the other one is just uniformity of how the buildings are similarly offset in distance from the public road.
Right. I mean, you know, I
Okay.
don't, I think the reason why they wanted to do it is kind of irrelevant, more to that this is just the way it was written, and so that's what I have to enforce with.
Yeah, I'm just trying to
and also
understand.
I
That's
think,
all.
I
city
think we might
planners
be
as well.
overthinking this a little bit, given that it is an old ordinance and that this section was written for industrial uses. I don't think anyone was thinking about urban design or walkability in industrial corridor at that point in time. And I would surmise that if indeed this interpretation is correct, it was probably to prevent storage yards and those kinds of things adjacent to the street that might be a health and safety hazard, and to make it less businesslike. So
Yeah, well, I mean,
that's what I think we have to think about this as industrial zoning. Although I think Reed has instructed us that we shouldn't be thinking about the intent of the authors and the approvers of the ordinance.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's hard to say what their intent was if I wasn't there.
Right, but I think we could say it was written for an industrial zone. And now we are in a time period where it's transitioning away from being an industrial zone, or it's going to be a mixed use zone. What I'm having trouble with is why whatever we do here needs to apply citywide, because we have a number of different zoning categories.
Well,
And because this is somewhat unique in being an industrial zone, and I could see reasons, and it's not likely that this would be used for an industrial use, but I could see reasons why you might need this sort of configuration for some of those uses. Is it possible to look at this as unique to this category?
Well, it is possible to look at for this category. I mean, I understand why the applicant wants to push the residential piece further away from the street in this case, because it's an industrial corridor. You've got traffic and noise and what have you. But, and as much as I sympathize with it, and I think it's probably makes sense, but that's not what the code says. I mean, the code says 100% of the facade, and that's where we are, is the applicant, and certainly speak up if you think I'm wrong, or that I'm saying, putting words in your mouth, Bo. I don't want to do that, but the way I've read the staff report and what we've talked about is the code doesn't say anywhere 100% of the facade has to be within the min max. And I think that's his contention. However, we're saying that is the rule. Just because it doesn't say 100%, it's the code says, for instance, as I had said earlier, when it talks about minimum setback, well, we mean that to mean no part of the building can go further in front of the minimum setback. So the minimum setback in this case is 0. No part of the building can stick into the city right of way. So if you reverse that, the maximum setback would say no part of the facade can go further beyond that. And that's our contention here, except for those 5 zoning districts where it talks about the percentages and gives a little bit of a variable. And so that's our case, and that's what we're asking you to rule on.
Could not that maximum setback have been because so much of our industrial land was adjacent to the river? And you were trying to maximize land out of the floodplain?
It could have been. I mean, I know that site actually pretty well, but it's been kind of filled in over the years a little bit. But when it floods, it gets certainly high back there.
Yeah, I've seen it pretty high, but I'm just
Yeah,
thinking
that's,
again about,
he's showing right there what the, you know, where it says the 50-foot sanitary sewer, at that point, it actually slopes up a little bit, but the rest is, you know, that paved trail gets underwater. And that might be why they did it in this corridor, but once again, I can't, you know, those, I think those are irrelevant to the case at hand of what the
Yeah.
code says.
Which is, I think it's helpful, but yeah, it doesn't, the
It just-
code says what it says.
I-
So,
Right, and unfortunately, there's just not more information on that and why the rules were made in this district, because there is another IC zoning district, so it doesn't necessarily, that river theory and the floodwaters might not apply to the other parcels that are over on Harris Street behind Bodo's and on, you know, that go to Allied, because the conditions there and topography are totally different. So, and as you said as well, that things might change in the next year when we rewrite the zoning ordinance. And so it's kind of tricky that, you know, but we're not a year away. We're right now, and the applicant would like to build something
yeah.
and doesn't want to wait to see what could or could not happen in the future for land use laws.
Two quick
So-
questions real quick, and this might be kind of getting ahead to what Bo's going to present, but read your interpretation, that is, if that rectangular section in the rear were at the front and the square were at the back, that this would meet the regulation?
Yeah. Yep. I
Okay.
would.
Just
Because
want to
that
clarify.
whole-
I'm
that
sure there's
whole-
reasons not, but
Correct. The whole rectangle would be the facade and the other piece would be
Right.
an addition off the back.
okay. Okay. And it seems like, and again, you obviously kind of knew getting to know this, but it sounds like that if we were to determine in the applicant's favor, it would be to establish the development as he's kind of sketched out here as by right in developing, whereas if you went before, you know, planning or zoning or whatever, this might make sense to them given all the context we talked about. But then at that point, it's a variance or it's a waiver or it's part of the SUP process.
Correct.
Is that right?
The SUP
Okay.
process gives him, you know, the planning commission has a lot of, I believe it's in section 34-162. It talks about all the powers that they have, and, you know, for instance, they can provide more density than that's allowed, and mess with the, alter the setbacks. That is a possibility, but the applicant might not want to do that, and we haven't unfortunately gotten there yet. So, you know, I don't know what the proposed density is. We're still at the infancy of this project.
the value of going for the SUP would be that it would be unique to this particular case and not necessarily applied citywide.
Correct. I mean, and it wouldn't even touch, you know, there would be no variance. This board would not get involved. That would be up to the planning commission.
Right. I'm still having a little difficulty getting my head around why the applicant can't apply for a variance on the setback that applies only to this particular parcel. And that then there would not be citywide implications on minimums and maximums.
Right. I just wanted to touch on base real quickly about, you know, we're talking about what the zoning district is for. And so the definition, or what the intent use of this zoning district is for areas of light industrial activity that is directed towards assembly and technological businesses rather than heavy manufacturing, consistent with the expressed intent that the IC district regulations do not allow any standalone residential uses. Residential uses are only allowed within a mixed-use building. Assembly, technological businesses, and mixed-use buildings are moderately intensive uses, and in certain locations within this district, City Council decided that building facades should have a specific placement relative to the adjacent property line. So that was in the beginning of the staff report that I did not read. So perhaps I should have touched on that. So, you know, there are some non-conforming uses, as we know. There's the paving, the asphalt plant that's there. There's an automotive business across the street. There's parking for dump trucks. There's a gas station, but you know, those they might phase out. I mean, we don't know. You know, they're still there, and they were there before 2003, and so they might still be changing. You know, as we know, land is always changing. There's another residential use that just went up. It's across the street, up the street a little bit, and a storage unit behind it. So it is changing, and so, you know, that hopefully will help decide or if you have any questions about what the district should be used for.
Any further questions? Or shall we give the applicant a turn? Hearing none, Bo, would you like to give us your take?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. And I'd maybe just like to start by saying thank you for having me here today. I know that it's time out of your schedules, and especially for the new folks on the board, the new board members, welcome, and sorry for kind of throwing you into the deep end quickly. I would like to get my screen up if Mr. Ritter, if you're open to that. Let's figure this out. All right. What are y'all seeing? I'm working off multiple screens here.
The 900 River Road BZA presentation.
Perfect. That's what I want you to see. Okay, and you know, just again, this is a kind of a funky way to meet. Again, thanks for having me. I know we're all looking forward to the day when we can sit in a room together and have these kinds of meetings in person again. My hope from here is to kind of go through methodically my interpretation and some of staff's interpretation and point out a little bit of where we diverge. I think there's actually a lot of commonality, but there is one important distinction, which is what brings us here, right? But maybe just before I jump in, I wanted to just talk real quickly about the purpose of the BZA and these questions about, you know, adjudicating it elsewhere, whether it's in front of, you know, the Planning Commission or council. You know, I think this is precisely what the BZA is designed to do, which is to hear appeals of zoning administrator decisions. You know, I think that's supported on the website. I just pulled it up on my phone. It says the purpose. This is not in the code. This is just on the text of the website. The function of the BZA is to hear and decide appeals from any decision or determination made by the zoning administrator and or to authorize variances from the laws set forth. So I think that this is precisely the right venue. Of course, I'm biased because I'm here today. But I don't think that there's a different venue that is more appropriate. And I guess I also would caution the board against being fearful of this decision applying to other projects. I think this is a really unique case that has only come up, you know, I don't know, Reed, you can jump in and tell me how often, but maybe never. And just this concept of maximum setbacks is not very frequent. You just don't find it in the code. And so I think that I think it's technically irrelevant whether this impacts, you know, lots of other parcels or no other parcels. Technically, it's irrelevant. We all know as community members that I get it. I get the fear that could be in play there, but I think that it's really rare, and I think that that's borne out by the fact that this has never come up before. So I would like to just maybe call everybody back off the edge of like, hey, this is a big, scary decision. I think it's not. So with that said, I think, so can y'all can see my screen, and then PowerPoint has this fancy laser pointer thing that I'm using. Can you all see that? Great. Okay. So again, as y'all know, we're at the very early stages of this mixed use project on 900 River Road. Y'all probably know the site. Let me, sorry, it's not toggling through my screens yet. All right, there we go. So there's the site, y'all know it. There's Tractor Supply is right across the road. The new building that Mr. Broadhead was just referencing is right across the road as well. And as many of y'all know, a lot of the city's heavy industrial users, this has been coming up in conversation, but a lot of the heavy industrial users are farther north on River Road. And so, as you know, there's a ton of industrial traffic coming down this road, which, you know, again, translates to this desire to pull the residential component farther back off the road. Again, probably irrelevant as to why I want to do it, but I think the context is important for y'all to know. It may not be important in the terms of your decision because I don't know that it's technically relevant. So, you know, staff's report has spent lots of their efforts devoted to kind of like reining the board in and telling you precisely what you can and cannot do. You can't read words into a provision that are not present. You must presume staff is correct. You cannot attempt to discern intent. And I think this is important because I actually think that staff is right about those things. And frankly, as someone whose livelihood is tied directly to understanding and playing by the rules of the road that are established in the zoning ordinance, it gives me a lot of encouragement and comfort that the words actually mean something, right? We're not all collectively trying to read between the lines and figure out the intent that was 20 years ago or 50 years ago, right? Like we just read the words on the page and they are what they are and they aren't what they aren't. And so I think it's important that y'all hear me say, I agree with that, and I actually take comfort and encourage that sentiment. I think it's technically right, but it also helps all of us understand that we don't have to be worried about trying to understand things that are not written there. It's just the words that are on the paper. So with that context, you know, again, I think there's widespread agreement with staff, and I'd like to maybe offer my opinion of the sole point of disagreement, which I think all of the previous dialogue, everything that we've talked about can be boiled down to how is a front yard measured. You know, we talk about minimum and maximum setbacks, but the code doesn't give us any clue as to what a setback means. It just points us to yards. So if setbacks and yards are synonymous, then all we have to do is figure out how is a front yard measured. So staff's interpretation is that front yards are measured at multiple points along, quote, 100% of the structure frontage. And that implies that there are multiple measurements at undetermined quantity taken along the entire street wall. And we don't know how often they're taken or if they're averaged at the end of it or what, but there are a ton, presumably, it could be, depending on design, a ton of different measurements. And alternatively, our position is that front yards are measured at a single point. I think if you look at the definition, you're going to get sick of hearing me say this today, but the minimum horizontal distance is what the definition says. And so when we look at the definition, I think the definition supports a single point and a single measurement being taken to try to determine how is a front yard being measured. So from there, you know, again, there's no artistic claim here. I've got some really rough illustrations. Y'all saw Mr. Ritter's screen a second ago. They're just meant for discussion purposes, and I created them myself. So forgive me for how they look like your children did them. Example number 1 up here. Let's see if you guys can see my cursor, I think, correct? So example on number 1 up here is the easy one, right? We can all agree that the front yard is right here on this red line because this street wall is straight, right? But example number 2 and 3 is where it gets a little bit trickier and where our interpretations, Mr. Broadhead's and mine, diverge. Staff believes that the front yards are measured at multiple points. Again, the locations at the red arrows, all 3 of these red arrows, but also at these points where the gold arrows are. It's worth noting that depending on the design, again, this could present problems because of how many measurements that could be implied, right? So if you have a street wall that is of frequently varying depths from the street, you have undetermined number of depths of front yard, if that makes sense. And in contrast to staff's interpretation, again, we believe that there's a single measurement represented by the red arrow alone, which is the front yard measurement. And this is nuanced but important. Under staff's interpretation, a front yard has multiple varying depths, right? Except in cases like example number 1, where it's all uniform. Every other building has varying depths and multiple depths of front yards. So I'm going to click down to some of the definitions. Again, I think this is where we can all take comfort in the fact that we are not charged with reading in between the lines. We're just charged with reading the words that are on the paper. So the second definition down is for a front yard, which is the one that we're all talking about here today. And if we reread it together, you'll see that the depth of a front yard is defined as the minimum horizontal distance between the street and the building. And we can all note that there's no reference to multiple points or to any provision within the definitions for multiple varying yard depths. And in all candor, I'm pretty confused as to how this code could be interpreted any differently. Again, you're going to get sick of hearing me say this, and I just have a couple more slides, but the minimum horizontal distance is what I want you to pick out of that definition. It's there. Let's use it, right? I'd just like to make 2 more quick points that further clarify how staff's interpretation is incorrect. So I'd like to flip back to my simple sketches, the ones that look like the kids did them. And now I've added a 4th example, because I think it's instructive. The front yard, of course, is easy. Again, it's just like example 1, it's uniform and there's one measurement. But if I asked Mr. Broadhead how he would measure the side yard, we all know what he would say. He would say that red line is the side yard. It's not the yellow yard. It's not the yellow line. And if you look at the definitions down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the exact same language. And so there's a big question here as to why staff thinks that the front yard is measured any differently than the side yard. And the same goes for the rear yard. How is the rear yard measured? Well, it's the minimum horizontal distance. How is the side yard measured? It is the minimum horizontal distance, and it's one measurement. It's the exact same thing that the front yard should be. And the second point I'd like to make circles back to staff's assertion that we're trying to read words into the code that aren't actually there. And I want to dig into that because it's important. Again, we're bound by the words that are on the page. Top of page 2 of the staff report, staff says that our criticism, I called it a poor interpretation, our criticism of the interpretation amounts to, quote, attempting to encourage the BZA to read into the applicable ordinance provisions and definitions wording and that is different than what City Council enacted. So I disagree on that, but let's keep going. Staff goes on to say in his closing argument that 100% of the frontage of the structure must be located within the min-max setbacks. And so the reason that I take issue with that is that Mr. Broadhead in his opening just said that the code doesn't actually say that. And you can't point to it because it's not there. And I would like to put up an email that Mr. Broadhead wrote after having 7 weeks to look at this issue. So after studying it for 7 weeks, Mr. Broadhead wrote, the zoning ordinance does not state anywhere that 100% of the frontage of structure be located within the min-max setbacks. So it doesn't say it. And so I take a little bit of an issue with the sense that we are asking you to read words into the definitions that are not there. I'm actually just asking you to read the definitions, and staff's interpretation, which is that, again, 100% of the frontage of the structure should be located within the min and max. That's not there. So I just want to flip down again. This is super elementary. I think you guys are already oriented on the property. But if you'll forgive the extremely rough illustration, this is representative of what we want to build. Again, portion of the building, the office component, is pushed up close to the street, which again, we assert satisfies the setback provision. Because again, it's taken at a single point, not multiple. So we satisfy the setback provision with the portion close to the street, and then the other portion is pulled farther back off the street. In our hopes and dreams, that's the residential portion. So I just show that, you know, it's super early and it's a cartoonish sketch at some level, but I think the transparency is important because there's no trickery or ill intent here. This is what we hope to do. So again, I think this is precisely the right venue to talk about these kinds of things. And my hope from here is that the board will respectfully correct a flawed interpretation so that we can proceed with design and construction of a project that not only aligns with the comprehensive plan, but also that will be a great asset to our community. So that's all I have in my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions or flip back to any of those slides if anybody would like to see them.
I wonder if you feel comfortable addressing why you chose an appeal to the BZA rather than initiating an SUP process, since you may end up there anyway because of density and other issues.
Well, Ms. Keller, I don't plan to seek any sort of SUP. And so, frankly, there's a lot of design dollars. I mean, Mr. Broadhead hinted at it, but you know, I have to spend a lot of design dollars to come up with a site plan, and then we can talk about an SUP, right? And frankly, if this interpretation holds, if the one that Mr. Broadhead has communicated today holds, then all of those design dollars that I've spent designing a building that is not 20 feet from the road or closer, they go down the drain. And so this is an effort to, again, use the BZA for what I think is the BZA's function, and to not waste time and money on a site plan that may go down the drain.
Mr. Carrington, I have one question about your interpretation of the setbacks. If we are to accept that it is a single point measured from the road, the right of way, would that conflict with other ordinances in the zoning code that specifies a percentage variance, where that would seem to mean that it's not just a single point, but at multiple points. And so a percentage is specified in order to allow buildings to be further away when their facade is too close to the street?
Sure, it's a great question. You know, the operable term there is street wall, right? We keep talking about 100% of the frontage. Well, the defined term is street wall. And so there is a way, and the code does it in multiple zoning ordinances, to enable folks that are building buildings to have some relief from that setback line and pull, like, I think Mr. Broadhead, you referenced the Cherry Corridor maybe. There are certain ordinances that allow you to pull, say, 25% of your street wall back farther from the road than the setback, right? But I think that if you go read, and we can pull them up and read them together, if you go read those sections, it's very clear that they establish a baseline. You know, here's how much you can pull off the road. It's 75% of your street wall. And so I take issue with the fact that Mr. Broadhead says the default is 100%, because the way that the build to zone definition says that it's measured, you cannot do 100%, because the build to zone definition is calculated as a percentage of the total frontage of the property. And it gets really technical quickly, but we can pull that up down here. So the districts that Mr. Broadhead referenced all include language that enable a very clear calculation, right? And they use this build to zone definition. Mr. Broadhead has suggested that this defined term is only applicable in those 5 zoning ordinances, those 5 zoning districts. I think that's incorrect. I don't know where the support is. It doesn't say if there is a minimum percentage specified. There is a provision for a minimum percentage, but it doesn't say this is only applicable in those instances, right? And so if you say the default is 100%, you cannot go to the street wall. You have to go to the width of the lot. And that is the intent of the code, is to try and make sure not that your building is pulled up to the street 100%, it's to build a certain width on your lot. That's the intent of the code. And that's why this what you're seeing on your screen talks about the measurement is based on the width of the building divided by the width of the lot. And so it's confusing, but in those districts like Cherry, for instance, you have to build a building across a certain part of your frontage. You can't just build a sliver of a building because they're trying to create a street wall. Again, back to the planning. But I think this notion that it defaults to 100%, you know, there's no reference to street wall, which is the operable term and which the other zoning ordinances effectively describe. So I just don't understand how you can say 100% of the street wall has to be within the minimum and maximum. Well, there's nothing in the code that supports that.
Can I ask a question if you've
Sure.
completed that thought? So do you mind can you let me share my screen real quick?
Yeah, sorry, I might need to take mine down.
All right. So just real quick so I can understand definitions here. We're saying right here in the area you've highlighted, primary street frontage right here needs to be within the 20 feet minimum, right? We're using that term. We're using front yard, but it's also the one that you've highlighted under number 5. Didn't want to go up, but this one right here, number 5, the primary street frontage. This is what we're talking about here, right?
Correct.
Okay, so you're saying this is primary street frontage, right?
Well, I think if Mr. Ritter, if you'll scroll back up, I think, so primary street frontage is not defined on this site as the front of the site. Primary street in this instance references certain corridors, certain roads in the city that are held to different standards, and River Road is one of those.
Right.
And which is why you see linking street down below it. There are different roads that are more minor, carry less traffic. Those are called linking streets.
Gotcha. But we're calling this because River's here. This is a primary street frontage, right? And you're fitting within the 20 feet.
This lot has frontage on a primary street.
So is this primary street frontage or no?
This lot, well, it's, you're
Is
pointing
this
to
right
the
here?
building.
This right here, is that primary street frontage?
That's not defined in the code. Primary street's not defined in the code. It's just, I mean, as it relates to a building, it's as it relates to a corridor. I just want to make sure that I'm being clear on that.
Yeah, private, so a lot of the zoning districts will break down a primary versus a linking street. So, and then it pertains to setbacks. But in this case, this is a primary street in the IC zoning district.
Okay, so we're agreed on that? Maybe?
Well, I think maybe Reed and I could agree on the fact that my front yard at this property needs to be between 0 and 20 feet. Reed, Mr. Broadhead, would you agree with that?
Correct. I mean, that would be the front yard, yes, because that is what, those are the min-max setbacks. I mean,
So-
those are the setbacks. So the front would be, I mean, I'd have to look at the code. I don't want to.
So
Doesn't say, but-
maybe, I mean, again, I think this gets real. I've spent a lot of time in this and it gets unwieldy quickly. I spend all my days in zoning codes and it gets unwieldy for me quickly, but I've spent a lot of time in it. And I think if we can focus on the definition of a front yard, everything will fall into place.
But why then is the 5B primary street frontage the one highlighted? I'm trying to, can you help me make that connection?
Because that provision right there is the only thing that makes me at this project, makes this parcel, I should say, have a maximum setback. That's the only thing. In the industrial corridor, there's not in general a maximum setback. It's only when an industrial corridor parcel has frontage on a primary street.
So
It's
why,
So I
why do
highlighted
you,
it.
Justin, because he's making this a residential, a mixed use development, that's where that comes into play.
Okay.
Otherwise, if he was just building a business, retail business, there would be 0 maximum setback. He could put it, wherever he wants to on the lot.
but this
So
is what applies, right?
That's what applies because it says up above in subsection A. So up to 6 stories of building height may be allowed for a mixed use building or development by SUP. So these are special restrictions because he's making it a mixed use development. Otherwise, if you read before that in the code section, which isn't in there because it's not pertinent, it talks about that there isn't a maximum setback. And I can open that up.
But this is what creates the maximum? This, I mean, is this the crux of it, or are we supposed to be looking somewhere else?
The use is what creates the differentiating setbacks because it is a mixed use project.
Well, this is getting pretty far afield, but
Yeah,
Mr. Ritter, you're an attorney. I don't think that the fact that A deals with mixed use buildings necessitates that B is applicable only in those cases, right? So again, we're far afield, but I don't think B, subsection B of 5B right there, is applicable only in mixed use. I think if you were building anything else by right, that's your setback. And the reason is that it's a primary street. And the planning intention, again, which is irrelevant, is that you're trying to create, a sense of place and a street wall and all those things. So, but I think the important thing is that it is applicable here. Whether it's applicable because it's a mixed use project or not, I don't agree with that, but it doesn't matter because that's the proposition anyway. So again, I think if you boil it down, the board will be best served by just saying, hey, how do we measure a setback?
Okay, so I
And
guess my own,
if you measure a set, I mean, which is a yard, right? So how do you measure a yard? And if you measure a side yard a certain way and you measure a rear yard a certain way,
yeah,
don't know why you measure a front yard any differently. And the code says it's a minimum horizontal distance. It doesn't say anything else, right?
yeah, I mean, so if we're saying this is a front yard and we're looking at it from this side, isn't this also a part of that? Like, what would this otherwise be if it's not a part of the front yard analysis? What would it be? Just
Well,
not analyzed at all?
I think it's important to pull up the definition of a front yard, right?
No, that's not it. What, did you have it in here?
Right, yeah, it's right there, number 2. So I just want to make sure that everybody knows it doesn't have anything to do with the street wall. It doesn't say anything about street wall. And there are other sections in the code that do that really well, but it's not here. I mean, it says it's being the minimum horizontal distance. I don't know how much clearer it could say.
Yeah, I don't see, I mean, just everything that I've seen, I don't know how you could definitively say one side or the other, is my initial thought. Other than how it's applied by the zoning administrator.
Could we arc back to how the side yard would be measured, because the definition is the same? And again, I think if you go down to those cartoon illustrations, we all know how the side yard's measured. It's measured to the point that's closest to the side. And Mr. Broadhead can jump in. That's how he would measure it.
Do you agree with that, Reed?
I mean, I don't agree, and that's why we're here.
But
the
Reed, you
side-
wouldn't
side
measure the
yard.
side yard like that?
I mean, I would measure it. Can you go up, please?
To which one?
I'm sorry. Where is it? Where he highlighted? Oh, that was in.
Yeah,
right,
I don't
yeah,
have
you're right.
example 4.
I can put it back up easy.
Right, and
So I mean, I'm happy to go farther. Maybe I can, would y'all be open to me putting up my screen for one more second and
Yeah.
I can show
Yeah,
you
go
one
for
more
it.
illustration? All right. Sorry again for how long this is taking. I know that this is technical.
Can you throw your presentation in the chat? Do you have like a PDF that we can look at it? If it's difficult, don't worry about it. That's fine.
Mr. Ritter, I should, but I haven't PDF'd it. It's just in PowerPoint because I wanted some of that stuff to fly in afterwards.
can I just say, all I would say is, so if we're talking about, the closest projection would be the minimum, then the furthest part of the facade would be the maximum of said structure. And so that's the way I would read it.
But I want to be careful here, because minimum, there's no defined term that is a minimum setback, and there's no defined term that is a maximum setback. Minimum and maximums are descriptive adjectives that are applied to a defined term, which is a setback, right? And so minimum setback is not defined. Setback is. And I think that's important. So you can't just take out the word minimum horizontal distance. That's applicable, right? And let's go down. Maybe this will. I left this out because I didn't think it was necessary, but I will flip down to it real quickly. I mean, this, again, setbacks are defined terms, right? And so they're consistent. They need to be applied consistently across all zoning ordinances, right? So if we flip over to the residential section, which again, it's different than the industrial corridor, of course, but it uses the same defined terms, right? And you can see real quickly from the illustration, some of these things have porches and some of them have other things that they don't measure for instance, on these two right here, you don't measure twice. You measure once. You don't measure twice here either. You measure once. And it doesn't say anything up here in the definition about measuring the minimum setback, because that's not necessary to say, because the setback includes minimum. Right? So if you're going to measure it this way in the residential districts, I just did this on a project Mr. Broadhead helped me with on Virginia Avenue, and we adjusted the setback and we didn't take multiple measurements. Take one measurement at the closest point.
In that instance, was that for a minimum setback or for a maximum setback?
It was for a setback.
Minimum or maximum?
It was for a minimum setback on Virginia Avenue. But again, I want to be careful. Minimum setback is not a different defined term. All we have is setbacks.
I would just say, I mean, if you want to, we sometimes use the dictionary, common, and we use that. I'm just saying, like, that would be what, you can't define every single word in the zoning ordinance.
But we have definitions here, right?
There are definitions. I agree with that. I just state that. But I do want to be a fly on the wall here and let the BZA, have their opportunity. You're here for them, not, I've presented my information in the staff report. And so.
One question for both sides here.
Okay.
Is there any historical guidance that we can use or think about from other localities that have, I've got to imagine other localities like we can't be the only ones that have dealt with this issue. Like, is there a split? Are there some localities that just do one and some that do every, or, do we have any insights on?
I don't have any insight. I don't really study other, I think, I don't know where Mr. Carrington does other projects. He might have a little more insight if he's worked with other localities, but I do not know.
I would just offer that, every municipality has very different code and it reads the way it reads, and they're all really different. And again, I think, we started this journey by saying we're not going to try to determine intent. We're going to stick to the words that are written on the paper. And, I think that's what we need to stay within. That's the charge in my estimation.
Any further questions for the applicant?
I'm not sure if it's appropriate to ask, but I will ask. And I know you haven't designed your project yet, but how will this open space be used? If you can share.
Sure. I don't know is the high level answer, because I just haven't designed it. But I would say that there are all sorts of other code provisions that govern where parking can be, how much landscaping has to be there. I frankly, that's my civil engineer's job, is to get into the depths of that. But certainly the intention, certainly the requirement, I should say, is to relegate parking in all corridors that require relegated parking, or to plant buffers in all corridors that require buffers. And I've candidly have felt a little bit handcuffed here in not wanting to spend time and money designing a project yet, because this is such a big factor in design. I maybe just, again, whether it's relevant or not, Ms. Keller, you said whether it's appropriate or not. I'll tell you that this line up here is the floodway line. And so I can't build this building right here. It's way out of scale is the point. Because the way the city's ordinance is written, I can't do anything in the floodway. I can't fill in the floodway. I can't build in the floodway. I can't do anything. And so this building in reality is going to all have to be closer to the street than this floodway. And so the scale is out of place, but I again, threw it together because I thought it was a worthwhile discussion, illustration more than anything. But you'll see that this line right here that's the FEMA floodway, and I can't do anything on the river side of that line.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's relevant, but
In the past, we have occasionally granted a variance with conditions. And
yeah, not to cut you off, I think if the board is concerned about having far-reaching implications, I don't know how appropriate that is, candidly, but if this would have been better cast as a variance, then I can do that, but I have to have grounds for a variance, right? And it can't impact all the other properties similarly, right? I can't just say, hey, there's heavy trucking along River Road and I want to pull my building off because that impacts a bunch of other properties as well. They could have that same claim. And so that's not grounds for a variance.
Yeah.
right, it's tricky terrain for.
It is. And the other thing here that's, just to make it trickier, but this is what I deal with all day, is that there's a deed restriction in this title that I can't build a building closer than 20 feet. And so whether that creates grounds for a variance, I don't know. We can all immediately say that I could build it exactly at 20 feet and not violate the deed restriction and be in compliance with zoning. And so I don't know that that's grounds for a variance either, which is why I didn't pursue it.
That's interesting.
Any other questions for the applicant? Hearing none, let's proceed to the internal board discussion. Any initial thoughts, board members?
Can you guys just open and close the public hearing because it's a requirement? Or ask
All
if
right.
there's anyone here from the public that wants to
Sure.
speak?
Any questions from the public? I don't think there's anyone here, is there?
There's someone.
There's several staff members on listening.
With a 703 area code.
Oh,
I don't know who that is.
Any questions from the public? Going once, going twice. Hearing none, we will close this public participation portion of the hearing and transition to internal board discussion. Board members, any initial thoughts?
Oh, it seems to me that Bo did a good job of netting the question out. The question is, how is the front yard measured? I mean, is it measured, do we take into consideration the entire facade, or do we just take into consideration that part of the building that fronts against the road, that front edge? The other point that we need to think about is that 100%, based on everything I've read and everything I've heard, 100% of that structure does not necessarily need to actually be considered a part of the front yard, just the part that is in the front yard. So why I put all that out there to make certain that I'm understanding this correctly, and you guys think I'm understanding this correctly, am I? I hear one nod, yes. Jen?
Yeah.
I hear Justin, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That being said, it looks like there is a bit of a loophole or fault in the way the ordinance is written. We probably should have been more intentional when we wrote the ordinance about, whether it's 100% or whatever for this corridor. So I'm, at least at the moment, until I hear different from you guys, I'm inclined to agree with the applicant. But again, I'm new at this, so I can be convinced otherwise.
Yeah, my concern is if it's only a portion of a building, if 100% has to comply, there's no manipulation that can happen. But if it's the minimum point and it's only a little sliver, and then all the rest can be whatever it wants, that cannot have been the original intent of the drafters. And my problem with this whole thing is that the code's not explicit enough to give us any real guidance. And I think my problem is I can't really see any great rationale on either side to justify their position. And my initial thought is, if it's unclear, shouldn't we give deference to the zoning administrator in this instance? And if things need to be clearer, shouldn't that be resolved by change to the code itself to say exactly what the applicant wants, or to get more clarification? These are just my initial thoughts.
Yeah, I think those are all very reasonable. The point that I may have missed is, yeah, there's just a little sliver. Does that sliver constitute the front yard? Yeah.
I think my thoughts
Yeah, I think I was-
there, Mr. Ritters, in that we're being asked to create a definition, or in this instance saying, giving right to build something where only a small sliver can be considered front yard, meeting that requirement. And given that council had multiple opportunities to clarify in this instance, as they've done in other places in the ordinance, I don't see how in an hour we can define exactly what front yard should mean when council has had many opportunities to do that and hasn't done so in this particular instance.
I think I see that just a little bit differently, maybe closer to Hosea. I found the applicant's definition of that minimum point of a single point of measurement pretty convincing. I think there's certainly kind of a smell test that 1% of the building facade, maybe that doesn't work, but maybe we don't have to go to that rationale. So I found that pretty convincing. I also found it kind of interesting that maximum setback only exists because of the mixed use residential, and maybe not super germane to this specific interpretation, but given the city's desires for more housing to be able to address affordable housing issue, seems like a pretty worthwhile interpretation to help get there.
Jen, I'm dying to hear from you.
From me?
Yeah.
Well, I think the lack of specificity is definitely an issue. I have to say that if I were considering being an applicant, that my knee-jerk reaction would have been the same as the applicants and yours, that as long as I satisfied the one requirement in the front yard, I would feel that I had met it. And my brain goes to, well, what if this were an industrial use? I could see a number of applications where a standard sort of traditional industrial building would have a reason to have a varied front facade, a loading dock, a distribution area, side service entrance, traditionally a railway coming in to take things out. So I could see a lot of application there. And so and because I'm an architectural historian, I'm just familiar with buildings that have a number of quirks to them and that they're not rectilinear boxes. And I, would like to see that. And it would seem that this is an area that could have accommodated that in the past, and that could be some reason why it's not specific. The thing that flips me over to the other side is that Reed is our zoning administrator and he does the interpretations. And if he feels that this would have unintended consequences across other zoning categories in the city, I would want to understand that before we made an action here. For one instance, no matter how desirable the project might be, and I can't envision what those are and in what districts he's concerned.
Well, I guess what I want to say is that the applicant had kind of said that, well, it says here, the applicant stated in his appeal, he believes that a poor interpretation should not be perpetuated simply because it has been applied to the past. And this is the interpretation that we've been applying in 15 of the 20 mixed use and commercial / industrial zoning districts. I would, however, say that this is probably the only time where we've had someone wanting to be further away from the street than closer to the setback. Normally sites aren't big enough and they want to just maximize the heck out of them and
Right.
put as much as they possibly can. And that's not the case here. So that would be the only differing factor. And that's why I wrote that in my staff report, because this is the way we've been doing it in those 15 districts since the inception of the code in 2003.
Reed, can I ask a clarifying question? Does that mean that when other applicants in the past have come to you for clarification, you have provided your interpretation and they've accepted it, and so have built projects with that in mind in those districts over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually talk to most applicants. We have 3 to 4 neighborhood planners that work with developers and do the site plans, and that's the agreed upon. You know, they go in the code and they see what their min-max are, and they design their project accordingly. And there are unique situations where someone, you know, like this, where they have questions and we settle it through a zoning determination. But I do not personally approve every single project in the city. That's what the planners use the same determination and factors when coordinating the projects.
And in your experience, has anyone ever disagreed with you, not an applicant, but maybe internally, as to why the front yard is measured at multiple points versus a single point as the applicant claims? Has that ever been a conversation?
I've been here for 15 years, and so I can't say one way or the other. I mean, certainly we have internal meetings all the time where we, talk through points, but it's not normally this topic. It's other variables and what have you.
It seems to me the most comparable thing is when I was on the planning commission and we had the issue with how to measure height, particularly for downtown and West Main buildings. And we spent a lot of time going through that, and there were differing opinions, but we did come to a resolution of that. And it would be unfortunate for an applicant to be hung up in that process, but perhaps that's what we need to do so that we don't have unintended consequences. Because once we got into that, we started to see, oh my goodness, if we applied this citywide, you could end up with something really horrendous on a suburban street, in Greenbrier, if you applied some of the formulas for how to determine height of a building. So maybe that's where we are, and that's what we would need to do.
Are you saying
Well-
punt to planning commission? Is that what you're saying?
No, I mean that to amend the ordinance, then of course the ordinance will be rewritten sometime in the future once there's a comp plan approved. And otherwise, maybe the best solution is to support Reed's staff report so that we don't have an unintended consequence. And if it rises to that level of importance, then it would go through the city process to clarify, maybe just to clarify it in the industrial zones, because that's what is of immediate concern. That's probably
Right, and that's what happens often is when we're going along and we're applying the ordinance and everyone is following the leader and doing everything and we all agree with it, and then a case will come up where someone disagrees and we can't find a valid argument to say no. They'll get that approval, and then we'll strengthen our ordinance so that a mistake doesn't happen again. So the unintended consequences do happen, and that's why the ordinance is getting longer and longer, because we have to think out of the box sometimes, and people do interpret things differently. And well, that's why we're here. But anyway, that might be what, you know, depending what happens tonight, you know, we might be deciding how we want to clarify the code in the future, so that there may not be an issue in the future.
I think it needs to be one or the other. It needs to be affirmatively determined by, you know, beyond us. I don't feel comfortable making this determination. Don't really feel fully qualified, to be quite honest. So.
If the applicant has a question, if you're willing to listen to or answer his question, or I don't know if the time's up. For that,
I think
yeah.
we're just pressed for time. I'm sorry, no. Any other comments or questions? All right. So where are we now? It's do we have? Let me just ask the question, Bo. If we took your question, can we limit it to ending Q&A by 5:30? 5 minutes, is that enough time for you to ask a question? Unless, okay, is everyone okay with that?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Ritter. Again, I serve on the county BZA, and so I understand the time commitment, and I appreciate your time. I guess I wonder two things: is if it would be helpful to pull up the Cherry Corridor, for instance, the language there, because I think that we're talking about this issue like there's no solution and like there's going to be all these unintended consequences. Well, there is a really well drafted ordinance in the Cherry mixed use district that talks exactly about this. It lays it out in crystal clear detail. And so I think that it should be relevant to the board that it's not like we have to create a new, build the wheel again. It's built and it's not here. It's not, the language is just not in the industrial corridor. Right. So if this language, if you're building something in the Cherry Avenue corridor, it's super clear exactly how to do it. It accomplishes the goal and everybody knows what happens.
Yeah.
And so it's there, right? It's all it takes is a copy and paste, and that's what should happen. If council wants the industrial corridor to function like that, they just change the percentage, copy and paste it, and we're there, right?
Yeah. So would we recommend that to the city council? Is that what you ask us to propose? Are we authorized to do what you want?
It would be
Change the code?
text amendment, and it would have to
It would be a zoning text amendment, right? And I think that's part of the problem is I've been dead in the water for over 100 days on my planning efforts, and I can't move forward. And frankly, I think this is an issue that's ripe for a decision, and I think that it's an issue that is uniquely right up the BZA's alley. And it's complicated. I give you that, but I think that this is precisely the BZA's charge. And can I make one more quick point, and then I'll
yeah, of course. Sorry.
I guess I just point us back to the fact that we started this by saying we have to just look at the words that are on paper, right? And Mr. Broadhead in his email says the zoning ordinance does not state anywhere that 100% of the frontage of structure must be located in the minimax setbacks. So he knows it. We all know that. We can all read the definition. And so I would ask the board, why would you be holding me to that interpretation when it is clearly not in the code? And that staff's interpretation of the front yard is problematic also because a front yard extends from one side of the property to the other, right? And it does not stop at the street wall of the building. It extends from one side of the property to the other. And so I would ask the board, how is a driveway, a vehicular access point treated? Right? How could you ever access a site if a front yard extends from one side to the other and it can never be deeper than 20 feet? How could you ever have a driveway? Because it doesn't stop at the building. There's no provision for it to stop at the building. It goes by definition from one side to the other. If you look at the definition of the side yard, which is number 2 up above.
So just to clarify, are you asking that we insert this language verbatim, but change the definitions and put it up here?
I don't interpret that the BZA has that authority. I think that's a change in code. And I think what the BZA does have the authority to do is to interpret the existing language.
So that
And
it says
so
this?
that's
I
Terry.
think Justin, I think what he's asking, or what the point is do you agree that my interpretation, that 100% of the facade is what should apply to this project, or that the applicant has proved that through his reporting that he's just following the code and that he should be able to build, something that's further outside the 20-foot maximum. I'd also say that, I think it would be important if you want to have the planning commission look at this, that this is a weak code or doesn't say enough, that, you make a recommendation that we look into that in the future. But I think I would ask that the BZA make a ruling tonight. It's a yes for me or a yes for Mr. Carrington, but to make a ruling. And then if you feel that we need to go further and, talk to the planning commission, we have the chair of the PC right here. I could write a memo and get it to them and talk about those issues for the future. But, there needs to be, I think, a little closure tonight for both sides, especially the applicant, because as he mentioned, he's stuck here and he doesn't know, what to do until this question is answered.
Any other comments from the board? We can go over and do, I guess I can start. I'm just too concerned about potential for manipulation and not feeling as though there's really not a lot of compelling logic on either side. I mentioned that before, and I think that if there's not, that I'm going to defer to the zoning administrator, and that is my vote. Genevieve, how do you feel?
With the lack of specificity and the need to address this, I really could go either way. I suppose I probably, if a motion were made by someone, would support a motion to support the zoning administrator's finding and that this be referred at the soonest opportunity to the planning commission to determine a policy and initiate zoning text amendments.
Okay.
So why don't we get a motion out there?
Okay. Motion to deny applicants' request and approve the zoning administrator's interpretation of the maximum setback issue before us, with a request to the planning commission to consider a zoning text amendment similar to section 34-658B1
Are you referring to the Cherry Avenue portion of the code?
Correct. To study, not necessarily recommend, but to study whether 34-658B1, that the language contained therein should mimic the industrial corridor required setbacks equivalent.
I think you're gonna need a second. You want to second that?
I second Mr. Ritter's motion.
I'm a little concerned about the motion being too specific about the Cherry Avenue language, which
Sure.
might not be the best thing. I think maybe to say, for example, other zoning categories such as Cherry Avenue offer more guidance. But I don't want for the BZA to be recommending that without us studying that as the best. I think that would be up to the applicant to make that case later.
That sounds like a friendly amendment to the motion. Mr. Ritter, do you accept her friendly amendment?
I do. Wait, say that again.
Maybe to just the motion that you made, and then to say consult other zoning categories such as Cherry Avenue for guidance on how this ordinance could be made more specific.
Just trying to write it out.
I think Reed's taking notes.
Oh, but if you write it out and we see it, you would fulfill a decades-long wish and desire of mine to actually see a motion before I vote it out. It's one of the things in my bucket list.
One second. Is it regarding front yards or primary street frontage?
So sorry, Mr. Carrington. This zoning ordinance has plagued all of us, as you know, for a very long time.
I mean,
just want to say both. All right, I'm gonna throw this in the chat, okay?
And could we add to that and initiate a zoning text amendment if they feel that that would address the situation? Sometimes it's hard to get a ZTA through, and if we don't make that specific, it may just sit there.
I mean, I'll write a memo and I'll work with Missy to get this in front of the planning commission. You know, whether or not they decide to act on it is up to their purview.
Right. But I do think it's comparable in a way to what we addressed with how to measure a building. Simpler,
Okay.
but comparable.
So I'm going to repeat the motion verbatim from the chat. Motion to approve the zoning administrator's setback interpretation regarding front yards / primary street frontage, together with a recommendation to the planning commission to consider alternative setback language elsewhere contained in the code, such as the Cherry Avenue corridor, and for the planning commission to initiate a zoning text amendment if that is what the commission deems proper. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, let's just do each person.
Yeah, Ms. Keller,
Aye.
Mr. Ritter,
Aye.
Mr. Ahmed,
Aye.
Mr. Becker,
You're
Mr.
muted.
You are muted.
Sorry, here's my moment of truth. Nay for me.
Okay, and Mr. Mitchell.
Yes.
Okay, so the appeal is denied 4-1. Thank you, Mr. Carrington, for coming in the BZA. So we're gonna move now to appointments. We have several new, two new BZA members. Mr. Mitchell, I believe your BZA term, something to consider, but it's gonna, I think for 2 years is what I think that, how long you're gonna be on here for? Can you?
I'll be on as long as the planning commission wants me on.
Okay, so I don't think it should factor in, who is the chair versus the vice chair, depending on when your term expires. I mean, certainly we can redo this. This is more of a formality, so we know who's running the meeting. So, I don't know who. It's up to you guys. Who wants to? You can talk about it and just let me know, and you can vote on it as well.
I think Justin and Jen would be ideal. I don't be either as chair or vice chair, but they've got the experience, and I think experience is needed to lead this group.
I second that.
Do you either of you desire to be the chair?
I would be happy to be the chair. The only thing that I can't promise, I want to be a city resident the rest of my life, and I don't know if I'll get my way. So that's my only caveat to being chair, because I know that if you're not, you have to step down. So that's the only hedge I'll give. But otherwise, I'd be, proud to be chair.
Well, I mean, you could be chair of the BZA. It doesn't mean you're a BZA member until your term expires. You don't have to, step down.
Really? Didn't Addison have to step down because he was a
No,
county resident?
Right. No, correct. Like when he left when he moved out of the city, he could no longer be a Board of Zoning Appeals member.
Oh, but he
That's-
wasn't. I see.
That had
Okay.
nothing to do with if, he was chair. All of you are allowed to be on the BZA because you reside in the city of Charlottesville.
Okay.
So if you don't reside in the city of Charlottesville, please let me know. But that is why you are on the BZA for the city.
Right. But so if you move, do you have to get off, or you're saying you have to get off immediately, or when your term ends?
You would have to let me know. And so I think it would expire when you move. Yes.
So that's my only hedge.
So if you're thinking about, well, I think your term of all the people, so we have everyone set up where someone's going to roll off every single year. And I think you're the next person to roll off, Justin. And so
Yeah.
you would have to reapply. It's the 5-year term. But because we had a bunch of vacancies, some people had terms that were less than 5 years because we need to have a constant, new people. And certainly you would be able to reapply. And at that point, the alternates would be able to put their name in the hat to be on the regular board as well. So I can, you might be up for it at the end of this year. I'm not quite sure. It's coming up.
Yeah. All right. Well,
so maybe
that
you
probably
want to
works.
be vice chair instead, or be chair, and then when you roll off, we'll vote again.
Either way.
If Justin would like to be chair, it's fine with me.
Okay.
I'd be happy to serve as vice chair. Although I think Hosea would be great. But I know you just handed over the gavel the other night, and you're probably feeling very, very free. And I've had to share a lot of things in my life, so I don't need it on the CD or anything.
Hosea had some moments tonight where it felt like he wanted to jump back in there in his chair, though.
That was Craig Fabio, the assistant zoning administrator.
Jumping in all quiet.
Yeah. Does anyone, is there a nay vote? How about that? It's a lot easier. Is it all aye for both? Okay, so that carries. So we have Justin as the chair and Jenny as the vice chair. And that's all I have for you. I don't have anything else to report, unless anyone else has anything.
I do have a question. And I'm not sure in the age of COVID what the situation is, but none of us have had BZA training.
Correct.
And I think Hosea and I have both had planning commission training, but it was a long time ago, I think, for both of us. I'm assuming yours was in your first term before you took a break, right, Hosea?
No, actually, I did it a couple of years ago.
Okay, so you have recent training. My training goes back quite some time. And there are other members who've never served on the planning commission or Board of Architectural Review or any of those decision-making recommendation bodies. So I would like to ask that at the earliest opportunity, we have BZA training for our members, because it's really difficult if you're not used to working with the ordinances and the procedures and all of those things. So if there's a virtual opportunity for that, I'd love to recommend it.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. The new members, I gave them a packet from Dr. Chandler. He did a BZA workshop for them to read through, and it's just the purpose of the BZA. There's actually a lot of good information in there. It's kind of lengthy though.
Yeah.
But I will, I'll definitely follow up. I'll speak with Missy and do some research, and we'll find a training for everyone.
And if that's not an opportunity right now, maybe a work session where we went through the materials from Mike Chandler would be useful.
Okay. I will look into that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Until next time.
Y'all.
Bye.
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 Bye.